Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives, brought to you today from Women's Declaration International. Today we have Speaking Freely, Part 2, written by Julia Penelope, and it's going to be discussed by Julia Long. So welcome, Julia, and over to you.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone, and once again it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to get straight into the book, because last time I did spend quite a lot of time talking about Julia Penelope. So if anyone wants to find out more, missed that and wants to find out more about Julia Penelope, that's all in the session from last time. But I want to get straight into the book because basically I ran out of time, so I don't want that to happen again. So this book, Speaking Freely, Unlearning the Lies of the Father's Tongues, is a book, in Penelope's own words, is a book about how patriarchal thought controls and limits the ways we live in the world. It's an analysis of how the structure of English developed to perpetuate men's descriptions of what our lives are like and what the world is like. And she coins the term Patriarchal Universe of Discourse, or PUD, to name the version of, inverted commas, reality created and naturalized by patriarchal language. And I was very interested to see in the chat last time that I had no idea of this, but apparently in some places, PUD, I don't even know how you pronounce it, whether it's PUD or PUD or whatever, has been used as a slang term for penis, which I had no idea of, and it's obviously an in-joke that Julia Penelope made in the book, and it was entirely wasted on me originally. So so I'm really glad to have had that added to my knowledge, which has definitely enhanced my enjoyment of the book. So what Penelope says very early on is that language isn't just individual words with their semantic content. It's a whole system of rules, and she says that via both the semantic content of words and by the syntactic arrangement of words, like the word order, the grammar, all of the kind of rules of language, that that English proscribes the boundaries of the lives that women might imagine and will ourselves to live. So that's how she kind of sets out her stall right at the beginning of the book. I wanted to bring up a few questions that, if we have time, that maybe some things that maybe we might want to talk about at the end, or I don't know, we might well talk about some of this in the chat as we go along. But I just wanted to make a case as to why I think this book is so important today. I mean, obviously, the analysis is still really necessary, because women are still oppressed by men, and patriarchal language is a key instrument of that oppression. But also, particularly at the moment, as we're all aware, there's a lot of debate, a lot of use of the term free speech. There's lots of discussion around this term, and I think that while we see this term being used, that it shows some kind of understanding about the relationship between language and power, and it shows that that is important. But I think often the ways in which we see this term being used, and the way that this idea of free speech is used to support often really opposing agendas, I think the understanding can be quite superficial. And I think this book, obviously with its title, Speaking Freely, it's all about the ideas of speech and language and ideas of freedom and liberation. I think it's got so much to contribute to enhance our understanding of these free speech debates. And particularly, we see this idea of, this phrase has become quite popular, compelled speech. So, the idea of, if we are, for example, in the workplace, where there are policies around, I don't know, use of pronouns in relation to gender identity rather than sex, you know, these kinds of things. And we might talk about this as an example of compelled speech. I think it suggests that before all of this, you know, transgender agenda on language, or the effects of transgender ideology on language, it kind of creates the notion that we previously had this, you know, language that entirely served our purposes, and we are free to use language as we wish, as if we are the kind of pure authors of our own linguistic destiny, and language is at our disposal, rather than, as Penelope, I think, so convincingly demonstrates in her book, that the language that we use, often without bringing this really to consciousness, can really serve male interests against our, you know, our own intentions. So I think she takes, you know, she has so much to say that is relevant and sheds a lot of light on these ideas of free speech versus compelled speech, etc. And I also think she has a lot to contribute, where, again, I think one of the things we see a lot at the moment are in these appeals to actually what feminists would have always been quite critical of in terms of patriarchal authority, the idea of kind of objective science, or the Enlightenment, or even the idea of like the dictionary, these ideas of these sources of authority as being kind of uncritically used to support feminist arguments, whereas historically feminists would have been very critical of notions of scientific objectivity or the Enlightenment, or, you know, even the, you know, the creation of dictionaries as authorities. So so I think she just has so much light to shed on all of these things, and I think she reminds us of the crucial role of language in shaping our perceptions, and actually ultimately then, in some regards, some important regards, actually shaping reality, because I think there's been a bit of an inclination to, because of the whole kind of postmodern sort of postmodernist discourse around language, that there's been a bit of an inclination to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to dismiss the ideas of language creating reality or shaping reality is kind of dismissed as all this postmodern nonsense. But I think Penelope reminds us that actually language does shape reality in really important ways, and we can see that happening at the moment, that as language is being changed, then it shapes people's perception, and it can then become enshrined in legislation, and then it actually does really affect our experiences and our kind of social reality in the world. So again, I think for all of those reasons, I think the book is so relevant and important today. So I think I spoke last time a bit about Penelope's assumptions at the way she kind of sets out the premises of the book and her assumptions sort of right from the start. So I'm just going to say a little bit by way of reminder as to what her sort of basic point of view is, and her sort of assumptions underlying the analysis that she gives us. And she says, our point of view, our perceptions, our consciousness determine and limit how we describe events, objects, and people. PUD, the patriarchal universe of discourse, constructs the world as men perceive it. It is a male idealized conceptual framework that defines the boundaries of sense for us. It dictates which statements kind of make sense to us and which statements we describe as nonsense. And she says that the linguistic choices we make reveal much about our assumptions. And why is she why has she spent, by the time she wrote this book, I think she'd spent a couple of decades, working on this. And she says, I've written Speaking Freely because I want to change the world. When I talk about structures in the English language as pieces of the patriarchal universe of discourse that coerce us to perceive ourselves as participants in that universe, I'm assuming that the prevailing descriptions of the world are inaccurate, and the world so described is not the best of all possible worlds. I'm assuming that we women want a better world to live in, and I'm assuming that we're capable of unlearning patriarchal assumptions and values and are equally capable of creating different descriptions of the world. So that's what the book is setting out to help us to do. So just again, a quick recap of the outline of the book. The book is arranged across 11 chapters. The early chapters focus on the historical development of the English language, and I want to return to a couple of things which I think I skimmed over last time that I think are really worth spending a bit of time on because they're just absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at some elements of that historical development of the English language. Then the middle chapters, then in chapter 3, she sets out she outlines what she means by patriarchal universe of discourse. And then in the middle chapters, she looks at the ways in which the semantic content of words, the semantic meaning of words are the ways in which those are used in this PUD to subordinate and marginalize women. So she looks at the subordination and marginalization of women in English and in some other language through the semantic content of language. And then in the later chapters, and this is what I want to spend a bit more time on in this session, in the later chapters, she looks at the role of syntax in naturalizing and reinforcing patriarchal ways of thinking. So she looks there particularly at things like grammar and word order to look at how they also serve to subordinate women and to reinforce patriarchal ways of thinking. And I think that probably in terms of feminist linguistics, feminist analysis of language, maybe historically we're all a bit more familiar with the semantic content elements rather than the syntax. And I think it's an absolute strength of Penelope's work that she looks so forensically at syntax and makes, I think, really compelling arguments and illustrates how they how very, very standard grammatical constructs serve to serve male interests and act against women's interests. So I want to spend more time on those later chapters. So, okay then. So to go back then to some of this history. So she begins in the first chapter, she begins by looking at, it's obviously a bit of a thumbnail sketch, but she begins by looking at the history of the different influences and invasions on the development of the English language from around about the 5th century. So she looks at things like the Germanic influence from the early Anglo-Saxon tribes, the Scandinavian invasions and the influence of Old Norse on the development of the English language, and then also Norman French from the Norman Conquest and Latin. So I wanted to go back, I think I mentioned this in the last session, but it's so interesting, I thought it's worth having a look in a bit more detail at what she says about the influence of Old Norse on pronouns, because obviously pronouns are such a topic at the moment in terms of our language and our free speech and compelled speech, etc. And often I do find it a bit frustrating that whole questions of language and power get reduced to just this question of pronouns without looking at pronouns within the wider context of like how they function within, you know, all the other kind of issues that are of concern to feminists about language. But so what Penelope says about the influence of Old Norse on the development of pronouns, that she talks about the third person singular, which we, you know, in terms of a bit of basic grammar about pronouns. Pronouns are the nouns, are the words that stand in place of a noun to refer to that noun and to save us from endlessly repeating nouns over and over again within language. So the pronouns are, you know, within English, I, singular ones are I, you, and then third person singular would be she, he, or it. And in Old English, the third person singular, the ones where we now have he and she, sounded very similar. They were, they both sounded quite like he. I don't even know how you pronounce these, but something like heo and hie, something like that, which referred, which had the sort of sex distinction of he and she. So I'm just going to read what Penelope says about this change in pronouns, because it really, I think, is very fascinating in relation to the attempts to change pronouns today in terms of sex pronouns. So she says, after the Scandinavian invasions, she says the newly arrived Scandinavian speakers changed the Old English pronoun system in important ways. And she says of special interest is the loss of the native Old English female third person singular pronoun heo. I don't know if that's exactly how you use it, is H-E-O, and the acquisition of, she calls it a maximally distinctive form. I don't entirely know what she means by that, but it's definitely, it's got a greater distinction in how you say it than the pronoun for he. And that is sheo, and she also gives other spellings of sho, she, and she. And we can obviously then see how this has come to indicate, this has come to be, yeah, what we now are familiar with as she. And she says, and this comes from a still unidentifiable source. But what she says is that prior to this influence of the Old Norse, the previous forms of what we now have as he and she, this heo and hie, she says, these two pronouns had started to become indistinguishable because just the way that language works in terms of common usage, we tend to, you know, shorten words or pronounce them in a, you know, a sort of quicker way or a less formal kind of way. And so these heo and hie had started to just sound quite similar as he. And she says at this stage, speakers of English might have opted for a native generic pronoun he, but they passed up the opportunity for reasons now lost to history, and various pronunciations with this sh sound gradually drifted south from northern Britain to replace the original Old English here. And she says that this, we don't really know quite why this happened, but that it's been talked about by linguists linguists as being the result of exceptional causes being at work. So, and the reason they think of this development as being down to exceptional causes is because linguists regard pronominal systems, or systems of pronouns, to be closed, in inverted commas, among the properties, so that they are among the properties of language that are most resistant to replacement or alteration. So what she's saying is that historically, linguists have understood pronouns to be very resistant to change. Other aspects of language tends, some features of language can change very quickly, and certainly we see through different kinds of usage, different kinds of influence, language obviously is not static, it changes all the time, but pronouns were seen as being closed, as being very resistant to change. So I thought that was extremely interesting, given the way in which what we have at the moment is a dizzyingly kind of accelerated change in pronoun usage that is a complete departure from all the historic ways in which those pronouns have been used to refer to, referred to biological sex previously. And she says, a linguist called Otto Jespersen, writing in 1964, remarked that loss and change in personal and demonstrative pronouns are infrequent, and that only extraordinary circumstances could be responsible for the changes in English pronouns. I don't know if it's me, but the chat has gone really quiet, so I don't know if I've totally lost everyone here. Maybe it's just I can't see it, but it might be. I hope I haven't lost people with all this discussion of pronouns. But the point that Penelope makes, and that I thought was really oh, thank you. I just wondered if yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks. Just wondered if I'd totally lost people there. But yes, the point that Penelope makes and that others have made is that pronouns tend not to change. So isn't that absolutely fascinating to see within the last, I don't know, not even 10 years, the last probably around 5 years or so, the way in which there has been in Jespersen's word, exceptional causes, or what Penelope describes as extraordinary circumstances that have been so astonishingly successful in attempting to change our pronouns. And we can think of what I see as absolutely corporate bullying, like the bullying of employees to either put nonsense pronouns into email signatures, or to respect the nonsense pronouns that that other colleagues might wish to use in theirs. And so we can see that not only are we in a kind of a situation of exceptional causes, but also the ways in which this is being enacted with the level of force and punishment behind it, to make sure that we to try to ensure that we adhere to these things. So I just thought that was so interesting. And I think it's also interesting the way that she, according to Penelope, and obviously I'm not a scholar of all these things in the way that she was, but I have no reason to doubt her scholarship, that she says that the Old English could actually have gone on to develop a sex neutral pronoun there, rather than to adopt the distinct kind of she and he. So I think that's a really interesting point, but I don't know. I think it probably would have, they would have gained some sort of distinction at some point. Yeah, I can't really see how that would have endured, even without the Scandinavian influence. But it's interesting that at that point it looked like it could have gone into a sort of sex-neutral pronoun. And the other thing, just referring forward a bit in the book, again making this point about the sort of resistance of pronouns to the usual processes of linguistic change and development. Sort of fast forward, you know, several centuries to an 1850 Act of Parliament. And this, again, I thought was worth drawing attention to in terms of the question of pronouns and the ways in which pronouns, the usage of pronouns, have been sort of steered to serve men's interests. That it was actually there was actually an Act of Parliament in 1850, smack bang in the middle of the 19th century, that made into law the use of the masculine, well, in linguistic terms, it's usually called masculine. I think the male pronoun, the pronoun he. There was an Act of Parliament that decreed that I'll read it out. An act for shortening the language used in other acts of Parliament, that in all acts, words importing the masculine gender shall be deemed taken to include females, and the singular to include the plural, and the plural the singular, etc., etc. So what this Act of Parliament did was to enshrine in legislation the use of the word he as supposedly representing women and men together. So I had no idea before reading this book that had actually been enshrined in legislation. I was very familiar, as I guess a lot of us are, of that that historical adoption of the generic he, that the idea of like mankind supposedly representing women as well, and the use of he as a sort of generic supposed representation of women and men. But that was actually enshrined within an Act of Parliament to say that in all future Acts of Parliament, they use the reason or excuse of brevity, that he will be used to represent everybody. So so again, how interesting that when it that obviously when it suits men, we are all supposed to use the male pronoun, but now if it suits other men who want us to pretend that they're women, then we have they attempt to coerce us into using these pronouns in a different way. So I thought that history is all absolutely fascinating and very pertinent to all the question of pronouns today. So and just another couple of things to say in terms of the historical development of the language, that she then goes on to talk about what she calls prescriptive grammars, and the ways in which the men in power wanted to standardize. This is like after the Norman conquest, and actually this is, I think she talks about the early grammarians as sort of, around about the way after the Norman conquest, around about the time of the 17th century, with the development of dictionaries and grammars. And she says that obviously English had lots of different dialects. It wasn't the kind of standard English that we know today. Of course, we still have different dialects, but there wasn't this standardized sort of notion of English. And that, as always, the questions of language were intimately connected to questions of power, and that men had a political interest in establishing the linguistic status of English in relation to the status of other European languages as they were developing as well. So there was this desire, which she says is the desire for linguistic control that was intimately bound up with the desire for power. And so what you see in the 17th century onwards is the development of what she terms prescriptive grammars. So they were written by these kind of, I don't know, scholarly men or or charlatans, as the take your pick, who developed these sets of rules about how English works and how English is to be used. And basically what she says that is really quite amusing is that the grammars that they developed actually did not fit at all. They didn't actually reflect how English was used. They didn't reflect the kind of the development of its own grammar. They were taken from ancient Latin and Greek, and then basically so they were those grammars. The men studied those grammars and then just imposed them on Middle English to form the rules of English. And she explains how they didn't fit by giving two. I think, again, for those of us who were brought up, with quite sort of traditional lessons about grammar, I think it's quite amusing. The first is about the split infinitive, that we have this rule in English that we're not supposed to split the infinitive. So the classic Star Trek thing of to boldly go, we're not supposed to do that because it's split in the infinitive. But obviously, because the infinitive in the English language is made up of two words, like to walk or to run or whatever, of course we can say to quickly walk or to suddenly run or whatever. It's very easy, and there's no reason why we shouldn't split it. The only reason why we have this rule about the split infinitive is because the infinitive in Latin is one word. It doesn't have the two, so like ambulare would be to walk, and you can't split that. So then we have this imposition of this rule of not splitting the infinitive. Instead, it was totally made up and just imposed upon us. And then she goes on to look at tenses, and she looks at the fact that English has modal verbs which express all kinds of different degrees of certainty and obligation. So instead of having just a simple future tense like I will, she gives the example of eating pizza, of I will eat pizza, we've got all these different ways of expressing I will eat pizza, I would eat pizza, I shall eat pizza, I should eat pizza, I could eat pizza, all of these which have all these subtle variations of degrees of certainty or obligation. And she says, because we have these modal verbs, the mapping of the Latin future tense onto English just doesn't work. But that's the tense that but it's the Latin grammar that has been mapped onto English in terms of by these prescriptive grammarians to try and create these rules that actually don't sit very comfortably with the language as it had developed. So why does she talk about any of this? What's this got to do with the men's oppression of women? So she says she talks about all of this to illustrate how thoroughly men have controlled not only specific elements of the development of English structure, but the way we understand its structure as well. Patriarchal grammars, these prescriptive grammars, justify descriptions of language as men would have it. And she says that the rules of grammar turn out to be as dubious as the received women about women that we hear every day. And she says that that's no accident, because men perceive language and women both as unruly objects that they must tame and control. And then I think I spoke last time about how she goes on to talk about the metaphors that men use to describe language and to describe women, and the way that those are so connected, basically by seeing language as an instrument that delivers meaning and women as a kind of instrument to be acted upon by men. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to what she says about the it's a bit hard to avoid using terms like gender because that's the term that's used in linguistics, but chapter 4 is titled The Sex of Nouns, and this is where she talks about grammatical gender, the classification of nouns by gender in Indo-European languages. And she says she sort of differentiates between those languages that have, and for those of us who studied, I don't know, modern European languages at school, we will remember, you know, la maison or la table, or, you know, whatever. Oh, is it le table? I can't remember now. Il table. I can't remember. Is it masculine? So obviously it was quite a new thing for us native English speakers to then be learning that words like house and table and, you know, whatever, chair, have what's termed a grammatical gender, because within the English language, on the whole, we use in linguistic terms, we use so-called natural gender, which is the term that means we used specifically sexed nouns and pronouns for things that relate to actual biological males and females, you know, like animals or humans, or yeah, or particular roles, I don't know, like mother, etc. So what she says about this, let me read what I put here. So what she says about this development and understanding of grammatical gender is that it has served to convey the idea that language is inevitably gendered or sexed. So she says, as one might expect, talking about grammatical gender, as one might expect, when sex terms become defining categories in a grammatical description, sexual dimorphism and heterosexuality are imposed on linguistic phenomena and become the filter through which these phenomena are perceived and interpreted. So she's saying that this kind of classification through sex or gender of a whole kind of, you know, linguistic system means then that this has a kind of a sense of inevitability about it, that and we can see, actually, she cites some linguists talking about, you know, the sort of puzzlement of, say, why a word like war is, you know, la guerra or la guerre is feminine, why, you know, speculating and theorizing over why a word like war would be feminine and why other words that you might expect to be feminine are actually masculine, all this kind of thing. And basically what she exposes is that it's all just completely built on sand, because the word gender originally is derived from the word genus in Latin, which simply means a class or a category. It was not used to signify sex. It did not mean sex. And she traces back the use of the term gender as meaning sex back to an ancient Greek called Protagoras. Let me just find this quote, because again, it's just so fascinating the way in which these things that are kind of we just take as given are often just as a result of some kind of historical quirk. So what she says here is that from its beginnings in classical grammars, the label gender was misconstrued, misapplied, and misinterpreted, primarily because Protagoras, the 5th century BC sophist credited by Aristotle with its description, chose the Greek equivalents of the English adjectives masculine and feminine, and the category neuter seems to have been added later, when he identified the noun classes of Greek. So it seems to be, what she's saying is that he just seemed to choose this choice of feminine and masculine without, no one's been able to, she says, I do not know what motivated Protagoras to choose the adjectives feminine and masculine to describe noun classifications in Greek. And I haven't read a historian of grammars who has asked. So that's quite mind-blowing to me that that all of this idea of these masculine and feminine grammatical genders, it seems to be this like random thing that was at the whim of someone called Protagoras, and no one really knows why he chose them. So as Penelope says, the English grammatical term gender is derived from Latin genus, from the Greek, which means race, class, or kind. It did not mean sex, biological or grammatical, as she goes on to show, as has been observed. But she says that Protagoras' choice of feminine and masculine to label noun classifications seems to have had a hypnotic effect on virtually every grammarian since. And they have been, as I say, kind of theorizing why some words are feminine and others are masculine, and how, you know, trying to find explanations for this, and why things, you know, why things have been sort of gendered or sexed in this way. And it just seems that there isn't any kind of known reason, and it seems to have been at the whim of this guy Protagoras. And it's quite remarkable that that is so, it's just been allowed to continue really without it being sort of questioned or examined in any kind of any kind of depth. So again, it's a bit like the question about pronouns. I think the kind of historical dimension to this really it just contributes so much to our thinking about language, because it shows that so much of what is kind of really embedded and, you know, enshrined in the kinds of ideas about language, the grammars about language, and then all the everyday language that we use. It just seems to be, yeah, like I say, built on sand. So those are some of the really interesting historical insights that she brings to bear in terms of the development of patriarchal language. And then I'm just going to, in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to go jump right to the end of the book, or the latter part of the book, where she talks about the ways in which grammar and syntax serve patriarchal interests, and they do that in a number of ways. And I think I did start to mention last time her use of this linguistic concept of deixis, which I should point out is spelled D-E-I-X-I-S. So it's that deixis, not deixis, it's deixis. And deixis is a linguistic term that is used to refer to words that serve the job of specifying or pointing to. So they should make meaning more precise. So an example of a deictic term would be the definite article. So if I say the pencil, you know, can you pass me the pencil? It's not just any old pencil, it's a particular pencil. And I could also be more precise in saying this pencil or that pencil or these pencils or those. or I could actually just refer, once I've established what I'm referring to, I could just use the word it to refer to this particular pencil. So deictic words are things like this here, that there, anything that points and specifies a particular object or person or thing. But also these deixis can be used in a way to refer to something that isn't really specified or isn't really there, and she calls this false deixis, when a particular deictic term has no identifiable referent. And the example that she gives really brilliantly is the use of the word it, which is something we all use all the time in our speech, often without being specific as to what it is actually referring to. So she gives the example of how it is often used to refer to heterosexual intercourse, penis and vagina intercourse. So things like bumper stickers, oh God, all these awful things like roofers do it higher, something like that, where it is taken as a euphemism. So the reader or the listener has to fill in what this reference is. And she gives all kinds of different examples where it is used as she calls it the dummy it, where it's a false deixis because it seems to be referring to something specific, but that is not anything that's actually defined. So, for example, if someone comes into the room and says, it's over, we don't know, we can infer what it means there, but we don't actually know. She refers to the idea of children playing tag, you know, you're it, or someone saying, I've had it. So we use this a lot without being really precise and specific as to what meaning we give it. And she looks at the particular context that she discusses, and I know I did start to discuss this last time, was a particular radio program about father-child, in this case father-daughter rape, where she looks at the use of the word it, and she looks at how everybody in the radio program, including the rapist, the reporter, the wife of the rapist, the child victim of the rapist, all used this word it, and the way in which the word it obscured what exactly the man had been doing and who was responsible for the action. So things like the victim of the rape saying it started when I was 10, and then I think the reporter saying to the man, why does it keep happening? So often again we see this combination with the verb to happen, you know, like it happened or something happened, to obscure exactly what, not just what happened, but exactly what somebody did. And she, within her analysis of this program, she then goes on to reframe rewrite the sentences, the quotes from the program, filling in exactly what that word it obscures, and it makes it very, very stark exactly the way in which it invisibilizes the actions of the man, and the fact that it was him that was responsible for performing them. So that's the use of the dummy it. And then the following chapter, and maybe this is one of the things that Julia Penelope is best known for in terms of her linguistic analysis. It's an absolutely brilliant chapter on agency deletion. So the deletion of the person or people, usually men, or actually I think in the examples she gives, always men, who are responsible for particular actions through the use of the passive voice. And the classic example that she gives and that I gave last time is this move from the active structure of sentence structure of John beat Mary, where you've got the agent, the verb, and then the person that it was done to, through to Mary was beaten by John, and then Mary was beaten with the agent being removed altogether. So once you put an active sentence into the passive voice, obviously it places the emphasis on whoever the action has been done to. And of course, then it allows us to, if we want to remove the agent altogether. Now, she does say that sometimes agency deletion is quite reasonable, sometimes it's inevitable. If, for example, something is being reported when we don't actually, or when the writer doesn't actually know who is responsible for a given action. Now, you know, sometimes it's inevitable when we know something's happened, but we don't know who's responsible. But as she goes on to demonstrate with numerous examples, agentless passives are used far more than just in those scenarios. They are so common, and often we use them ourselves without even realizing, because they're so commonly used. And she talks about all the different patriarchal motivations as to why this that men might use, or men might have naturalized this construction in our language. So she talks about how the use of the passive voice can be used to appeal to ideas of authority. So let me see, page 149. So I'm just going to go through all these different examples to I think hopefully give a sense of how common they are. So the appeal to authority, the authority could be, you know, the idea of sort of divine authority or divine intention. So this kind of romantic notion that we've heard, that it was a love that was meant to be. So obviously that's putting it in the passive form, but who meant it to be? The only possible answer would be some sort of divine intention, or as again we've probably seen in all kinds of archaic biological textbooks, woman is intended for reproduction. She has been appointed to take an active part in the reproduction of the race. So this idea of using this use of the passive form to reinforce ideas of some kind of ultimate authority, in this case here divine, but it could also be institutional authority or other forms of sort of universal authority. So the passive form could be used to serve those purposes. Very often it's used to, as Penelope says, to protect the guilty, to deny or obscure the responsibility, as in the scenario that I gave before of John beating Mary. So we commonly see and hear the passive form being used to kind of draw a veil over who's responsible for a certain decision or a certain action, and to obscure the power relationship of that. It can also be used to serve men's claims to some kind of pseudo objectivity. So things like the way in which, again, I just remember this from school days, like the scientific method, where you weren't allowed to say, oh, I lit the Bunsen burner. You had to say the Bunsen burner was lit, or, you know, this construction of some kind of objectivity, that these things were done without any kind of human agency, but they were simply done, and therefore the result of that is somehow objective and beyond, it can't possibly show any kind of like bias or human intervention. And she says that the pseudo objectivity motive serves to help the writer turn the most absurd opinions into facts that then it becomes quite hard to challenge. And then following on from that is the use of the passive in terms of trying to garner kind of basically some kind of intellectual pretension, trying to garner some kind of weight to your argument by saying things like it is known, or it is thought, or it is understood before your sentence. So you kind of try to marshal all of these other great thinkers, much like yourself, who have all kind of argued this before you, so you can claim this some kind of authority. She also talks about how the passive can be used, and this is something I think really that we want to be very aware of as women and as feminists, that actually, in terms of a victim's perspective on something that someone else has done to them, that it can often be much more acceptable to listeners to talk about things in the passive voice. So she gives an example of a woman saying, "You wonder how the power you once had was taken away from you." And she talks about how who's taken away the power is eliminated, but also the victim isn't talking about her, or the woman isn't talking about herself in the first person. So she's kind of abstracting it to also erase herself from the scenario as well. Instead of saying, "I wonder how that man took my power from me," you wonder how the power you once had was taken away from you. So these are the kinds of things which you give so many different examples of the use of the passive in ways that that often would, as I say, are so normalized in the language that we wouldn't necessarily be aware of how frequently we're using them. So I seem to have lost my thing. So just to, we're nearly up to time. Just to finish then, the other use of passives that I think are really, really important to be aware of is when the passive is taken to sort of an extra level, where an active verb is rendered into an abstract noun, which even more obscures who did what. So something like he destroyed the evidence, or they destroyed the village, becomes the destruction of the evidence, or the evidence, the destruction of the evidence, or the destruction of the village. So we have in place of that active verb that shows the agent, we have this abstract noun. And that's something obviously we see all the time in terms of things like domestic violence, sexual violence, gender-based violence, this kind of abstract noun of she was a victim of domestic violence, where the male agency and his specific actions and modes of control are abstracted into this noun that then becomes a topic in and of itself, quite divorced from the original clarity of the active form. So it's sorry, once again, I spoke for too long. I think we're pretty much up to time. I don't know if someone else is going to, don't know who's actually going to end the session. Joe is, I don't know how we're going to end it now. Joe, are you going to end the session? Because I just realised that we're almost up to time.
No, Ebru's going to do it.